I'm going to open my apps menu in the upper right corner and click on organizations. The organizations app is what I consider kind of a cross-functional foundational app. It is typically in an ERM setup, one of the first things that you're going to set up. And the organizations app is meant to capture any relationships that you have with kind of external entities. So they can be your vendors. This is strongly equated to your vendor file in a previous system. However, it can also be used to track relationships that you have with other organizations, maybe a consortium you belong to, or a membership organization. And so the organizations app has functions in both acquisitions, where the vendor designation really comes into play, but also in e-resource management, because the organizations app allows you to track the contact information, the interfaces, so various maybe administrative portals or statistical portals that you may need to log into to get your ERM statistics or to manage things like EBSCO admin might be an interface that you want to track. This is the link that we use to access this interface. And then maybe here are the login credentials that we use as a library. So that information can all be tracked here, as well as specific contact people. So you may have an organization for EBSCO that has the general customer support line or a link to EBSCO Connect. But then you may also have the specific emails for Patty or for Brooks or for Kyle or for me that you want to track on your EBSCO organization record. So the organizations app is structured in the way, very similar way to all of the apps that we're going to be looking at in Folio. You have your search pane on the left. When I perform a search, I can perform a text-based search, or alternatively, I can use my filters in conjunction with a text-based search, or perhaps I can just use the filter on its own. So if I wanted to see all of my active organizations, I can just check off this filter and I'll see that I have 37 records. And there are few enough in this tenant that I don't need to advance through, but if I have more than, I believe it's 50 organizations, I can page through all of my organizations using the previous and the next buttons down at the bottom here. So if I want to create a new organization, I can click on New in the upper right-hand corner. I can name my organization. And then I provide a unique code for my organization. Now, the codes, they must be unique among your organizations. And I strongly recommend that you keep them fairly simple, typically alphanumeric. One of the great things about Folio is it doesn't have a lot of character restrictions, but one of the things about Folio that is also great, but comes with some additional considerations, is Folio can integrate with various external systems. There are a lot of supported integrations now, and then we have members within the Folio community that are investigating ways to use Folio to integrate with other systems. And when you're integrating with an external system, oftentimes there are restrictions in that external system that you might need to be cognizant of. So even if Folio can support you putting in emoji in a certain field, for instance, which is very fun, very cool. If you're integrating with, I'm just going to use EBSCOnet as an example, maybe they don't allow emojis to be in their organization code. So if you can keep your codes fairly simple, alphanumeric, and something that's kind of intuitive to you, that if I look at this code, I know which organization this corresponds to. Those are kind of my recommendations in this area. The accounting code, this is something that is more specific to acquisitions workflows. So we'll go over this in greater depth in the acquisitions training. But organization status is very important. So you can have an organization that is active, inactive, or pending. And so most of your organizations are likely going to have an active status, meaning this is somebody that we are actively working with or transacting with. But you may have an organization that you designate as inactive. Maybe you used to order from them and they went out of business. Rather than deleting the record, you may want to make it inactive. And that way you're preserving any information you had about that organization without deleting it and removing that in that historical information. Once something is designated as inactive, it can no longer be used in your acquisitions transactions. And then pending, maybe you're investigating joining a consortium and you're not really in the consortium yet, but you want to start tracking some information about it. You can create a pending organization and start to track some contact information, making notes maybe about correspondence and things like that. And then you can bump that up to an active organization status if you decide to become a member, perhaps. Melissa, I see your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes. So if an organization status becomes inactive, it can never become active again?
No, that's a great question. So you can reactivate by editing the organization and moving their status back to active. But so long as they're listed as inactive, if you tried to, place an order or create an invoice from an acquisitions perspective, you would be blocked from opening that order or paying that invoice because they're not deemed an active vendor at that point.
And also a second question. Let's
Sure.
say an organization has done a name change, either because purchased by another entity or just became a different name, but you want to preserve the old name for record keeping.
Yes.
Can you link these names?
Melissa, I feel like you're my plant in the audience because you're just a couple fields ahead of where we are. But
sorry.
The answer, no, don't be sorry at all. I love when this happens. But yes, so you can do that. And I am going right there in just one moment. So great question. And today, just to get through the rest of these fields here, your default language, this is not a required field, but you can select the language in which you transact or communicate with this specific organization if you so choose. This vendor checkbox, we're not really going to get into today all that much, but it does have to do with acquisitions. If I want to order from this organization or pay this organization for something, they need to be designated as a vendor. And when I check this vendor checkbox, you'll notice that we get a lot of extra information that we can fill in on this organization record. Now, it's not required information, but it is information that lends itself more to acquisitions workflows. So that's kind of a sneak peek of coming attractions in the acquisitions training. Acquisitions units, same thing. That is a way that you can kind of partition off records. Let's say that you are one of 5 acquisitions teams and you all have separate budgets and you maintain your own orders and invoices. Acquisitions units are maybe something that you want to use to kind of restrict who can interact with which records. And then the description is a free text field that allows you to put in maybe some brief information about who this organization is, why you're tracking them in your Folio tenant, or maybe what the nature of your relationship is. And then we get to the field that will help with Melissa's question here, and that is the alternative names field. And so this is a repeatable field on the organization record that allows you to enter in other names. So a good example of what Melissa was talking about is actually Gobi Library Solutions. Many people in the library field still think of Gobi as YBP or Yankee Book Peddlers. And that is completely fine. That's where your brain goes. That's how you want to search for this record, maybe. But you want the name to reflect kind of the current name of the organization. So maybe I name this Gobi Library Solutions. But then I have an alias for Yankee and an alias for YBP. And if I've entered both of these aliases on this record, I will be able to search Gobi Library Solutions, Yankee, or YBP in the Organizations app, and any of those will return the record that I'm looking for. And in fact, if I cancel out of here and I were to look, I do actually have a record for Gobi where you can see YBP and Yankee Book Peddlers listed here as my aliases. And so if I were to kind of reset and search for YBP, you'll notice that Gobi does in fact come up. When I search within the Organizations app, it will search my search term within name, code, and alternative names. So you have that flexibility there. And so once I have created an organization, this can be a very bare bones record. The only required fields on the organization record are the name, the unique code, and the organization status. As soon as I've entered that information, I can save and close, and I have an organization record. And that's what I did this morning with the Alexander Street Press. So I simply created a name, I added my code, I gave it an active status, and I did designate this as a vendor so that I could create an order for later in our training. But now maybe I want to come back and kind of flesh out this record a little bit more. If I find my record in the upper right-hand corner, I have an actions menu. I can click on actions and edit. And this is a good way to go about adding in specifically contact people and interfaces. I always add this information after initial save because these are not really part of the organization record itself, but rather kind of their own sub-database of connected records that you can associate with an organization. So we'll come to that in just a moment. But first, I want to take a look at contact information. When I look at contact information, these are kind of the contact details for the organization at large. So maybe for Alexander Street, I want to add in maybe their address. So I can add an address here. This will be used as the primary address by default if it is the only address added, but I can add multiple addresses here. And so I'm just going to go ahead and add in their address.
Molly?
Yeah.
There's a question about searching and alternative names.
Yes.
Are those searches case sensitive?
I don't believe that they are.
I don't think they are either.
Yeah, we can definitely test that out, but I believe that case insensitivity is the rule of the day there.
Right.
Good question. And we'll test that in just a moment, just to be safe, because I always believe that seeing is believing. So I'm entering in my address information here. And all of these fields are fairly self-explanatory, but one that might be unfamiliar is this categories. So categories are defined by you at your folio tenant level within your organization settings. And this allows you to kind of apply a designation to contact information as well as contact people. So is this maybe the address that we should use for returns if we're returning something to them? Or is it something that if we're paying them, this is the address that we should use? So I can apply as many categories as I'd like here. And so I'll just say this is what's used for returns and accounts payable. And this is applying both of these categories here. If I add a phone number, I can go ahead and do that. I can designate the type. So I can say that this is their office phone. And then I'm going to say that this is their customer service line. So now if I were to save this record, my contact information, you'll see that I have these categories applied here. So it's just kind of a display way of organizing your information. Now I have my customer service here. And then under accounts payable, you'll notice I have my address, but this has both categories applied to it. So it's actually going to appear under either category. If you have some contact information that you don't wish to categorize. So maybe you do want to categorize the addresses for the sake of clarity, but not the phone number. The use of categories is not required. So if I wanted to take away the category here on my phone number and then save, you'll notice here that that will fall into uncategorized territory now. So you don't need to apply the category. It's just there for the sake of organization, especially in an organization like the one that I work for, EBSCO, where you might have, EBSCO net information on the EBSCO record. You might have, EBSCO information services. You might have FOLIO information on that record. So you kind of want a way to organize when you have that much information going on.
So here's a good question, Molly. How do you set those categories?
Absolutely. So that is an excellent question. So if you come into apps and settings, and depending on your permissions, you may or may not be able to see your settings. So you would want to talk to your system administrator. Under organizations and categories, this is where you can define the categories that will be used in the organizations app. And you can create one by clicking on new and just entering your value here. And then you're able to edit existing or remove existing. So heading back into our organizations app, and we're just going to take a quick look before we move on with contact people and interfaces. And I'm just going to do a search for YBP just to show you it is caps in the alias. I searched for it in lowercase, and so that is case insensitive, just to loop back to that question really quickly. So if I'm coming back to Alexander Street Press, I'm going to come back in, I'm going to edit, and now we're going to talk about contact people and interfaces. We're going to ignore the rest of this information for today, as that is specifically dealing with acquisitions level information for organizations. So we'll go over that in the acquisitions training. So for contact people, I can expand this accordion here and click Add Contact. Here, you'll see anyone that's been added as a contact will be listed here. So this allows you to apply a contact person to one organization, and then maybe that person moves and starts to work for another organization. Rather than having to create a whole new contact record, you can maybe make them inactive on their previous organization, and then you can apply them to your new organization. But in this case, I'm going to create a brand new contact. So when I click on new in the upper right-hand corner, I get a form where I only have 2 required fields, last name and first name, but I have the ability to add quite a bit of information here. So I am going to pick on Patty just because she's here, and she's going to work for Alexander Street for today. And so I'm going to be formal and call her Patricia here. But in my notes field, maybe I say, prefers Patty, ask about her cat, Lenny Briscoe. Because maybe you like to have a little personal connection with the contact people you're working with. So I'm going to give her an active status. This is not required, but it's just kind of an indicator that, yes, Patty currently actively works for Alexander Street. And then I can say what language I correspond with Patty in if I would like to. And then I can apply categories. So I'm going to say that Patty is my support person at Alexander Street. And then I can put in her email. So I'm just going to say pattyw@alexander.com, not real. And I can categorize this as her support email. I could put in her direct number if I wanted. I could maybe put in a link to her LinkedIn profile. And if you have the address for this person, you could add in that information. And all of these are repeatable. So if I had multiple emails for Patty, I could add those in. Once I save this record, this is not only creating the contact record for Patty, but it's also applying her contact record to the organization on which I initiated that addition. But now if I were to add another contact, you can see that Patty is listed here. So if I were to go over to the EBSCO record, I could select Patty and apply her over to the EBSCO record. Interfaces work in much the same way. So if I wanted to add an interface, you can see here that I have one on ABC Clio, but I want to create a new one specifically for Alexander Street Press. And when I do this, I've got very few required fields, just the name basically, but chances are you want to add a few more things here to make this truly useful for you. So I'm going to say that I want to add the end user here, and I'm going to go ahead and enter in their resource center. So I'm going to say Alexander Street Resource Center. And then I'm going to paste in my URL into this URI field here. My username and password, these are not required fields. We do advise not to store personal login credentials here, but if you have an account that the whole library uses, then perhaps you would want to enter that contact information here. And there is a separate permission that allows staff to be able to view these credentials. So I'm just going to make something up here. I'm going to say my username is Molly D. And then my password, I'm going to go ahead and say is puppies25 with an exclamation point. And so I can show to make sure that I put that in correctly. I can add notes about this interface. So maybe if you're required to change the you're required to change your credentials every 90 days. That might be something that you want to note here. Or if you need to contact someone specific to do a password reset, that might be something that you want to reflect here. And then for every interface you add, you have the ability to say if statistics are available from this specific interface. So if this is where I truly log in to get my statistics for Alexander Street, I would want to check this off. And then I can add some different information here. I can specify a delivery method, online, FTP, email, or other. I can specify the statistics, perhaps counter, or maybe coming in an Excel or a delimited format. I can indicate where I'm locally storing this. And by this, I mean maybe in internal drive, a shared drive within the library. I could say it's in the filing cabinet in Patty's office. We print hard copies. And I can also specify an online location. So if you upload these to a Google Drive or a OneDrive or a Box, and you want to specify the folder that your statistics are stored in, you can add that here. Then my favorite field is the statistics notes field. I used to do statistics for an organization that I worked for. It was 36 libraries. And whenever I had to do statistics, it was very rare that they came out in the way that my end users needed them. So I would need to, sacrifice my firstborn and spin around 3 times and carry the one to get it there. And I had a whole tome that I created for if I was out of office and somebody else needed to process the statistics. So rather than having to create that tome, I could just put the steps to get these statistics here. And so if I were out of office unexpectedly and somebody needed to run these statistics, they could simply access the interface and have the instructions listed here. So once I have saved this information, it acts in the same way. It creates this as an interface, and it also applies it directly to this specific record. And because this is a kind of a carry-on record rather than adding to the base organization record itself, I don't even need to save and close. I can just hit cancel, but now you can see that Patty is listed as my contact person, and I do have my interface information available for me here. And because my user has ERM admin permissions, when I click on show credentials, I can see my username and password. and hide the credentials. If I were a staff member that didn't have permission to view those credentials, I would not be able to do that.
Molly, a question. What about exporting this information out for any reason, like creating a manual?
Yeah, so that is a great question. Right now, there is not a way to export to like a delimited file from the organizations app. I believe there is a feature within the Folio community to do that. So right now you would need to use the Folio APIs to do that, but I believe there is a feature to expand into other apps to do this because they have precedent for it in the licenses app as well as the orders app. So they're kind of making progress towards expanding that. Great question. All right. So the last thing that I wanted to show you is the ability to add notes to your organization record. And so if I am looking at my organization record from the view screen, I have an accordion for notes. Right now it has a 0 next to it, meaning that there are no notes added to this record. If I expand, I can click on New and add a note here. My note types are all designated at the tenant level. In your settings app, there is a specific area to establish these note types because these are part of what I call the notes app. It's not really a standalone app in the way that the ones listed across the top are here, but I consider it more of a helper app where you can create these notes and then access that notes interface from a number of different apps. So it's available in the users app, it's available in the eHoldings app. Most of the apps that you're going to be working with in Folio have this notes app present. And so you can specify the type of note you're adding here. So in this case, I have created a note type called the organization note. And I'm just going to say support SLAs changed in 2022, and I'm going to say access the new support SLAs here.
Molly, say what an SLA is.
Oh, yes. So an SLA is a service level agreement. So oftentimes part of your contracts with an organization saying if we subscribe to this resource and we have a problem, we are going to submit a ticket maybe to your support center, and we need to have a response within X amount of hours and a resolution within X amount of days or things like that. So the SLAs, typically an organization in our industry will have an SLA, but the SLAs may vary from organization to organization. And thank you, Patty. I get acronym happy.
I have a question, Molly, about the notes.
Yeah, please.
Is it basically not just when you create it in this way, it's not just unique to this particular organization. It is sort of a universal thing that you can, because you said earlier that it's so tied with other apps. Can you then find this note other places in a sense, as opposed to being just unique to this particular instance in this organization?
So that is a fantastic question. And the answer is kind of yes, and, or yes, but. So the Notes app kind of works differently depending on which app you're in. So right now, in the Organizations app, I can only apply a new note. I can't assign an existing note, but there are, and the users app works in the same way, where if I'm creating a note on this organization record, it lives specifically on this organization record. But then you have an app, I believe, in the licenses app. I just want to make sure this hasn't changed in my new release. I just got upgraded. Yes, so in the licenses app here, you can see that I have this option called assign unassign. So this allows me to take any other license note. So let's say I want to do a license note here. Oh, and I don't have one, so we're just going to call this. So I'm going to save that here. And then we'll create just another license really quickly. Test. And so now if I were to go to the notes here and hit assign, I can see this license note that is available. So it kind of depends on the app that you're working in, whether or not you have the ability to assign a previously created note or not. I believe right now it's licenses and agreements that allow that. I need to double check on the acquisitions apps, but I know users and organizations, you only have the ability to create a new note, and that note lives specifically on that organization record.
So a question, is there
Yeah.
a way to browse through all the notes or all the notes of a specific type?
So I think this is kind of the closest that you're going to be able to get to that is the assign, unassign, and then clicking on unassigned. And that will bring up any notes that are eligible for assignment that have not yet been assigned to this record. So it's not really doing exactly what you're asking about, Patty, but that's kind of the closest that there is. The other place that you can look just for kind of high level information is if you go into the settings app, notes, the note types are all defined here. When I click on general, I can see the number of notes assigned to each note type. So it's not giving you access to those notes specifically, but telling you which of your note types are being most heavily used. All right. So before we leave off organizations, I do want to point out that you do have the ability to delete an organization. However, when you delete an organization, it is gone. And so the record that you had, the information for this record, that is no longer going to be accessible in your Folio tenant. So what I typically recommend when I'm working with libraries is maybe editing and giving something an inactive status instead. So that way you're preserving that information. And then if you ever need to reactivate because you're going to resume a relationship with this organization, you have that historical background, you have that contact information saved, and you're minimizing the amount of updates that you would have to do. Whereas if you're having to recreate from scratch, you're having to duplicate past effort.